And I'm going to now invite ERI team member, Brother Terry Dowling, okay, to welcome everyone and to give us an overview, a small overview of Edmund Rice International. Over to you, Terry.
Thanks, Tino. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
So if you open up the first slide, Tino. So welcome to everyone from wherever you are. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and thank you for giving up your time. So just as by way of introduction about Edmund Rice International. Edmund Rice International was started or conceived or whatever quite a few years ago, around 2008. It's an initiative of the two congregations of Edmund Rice, the Christian Brothers and the Presentation Brothers, to work in advocacy. So Edmund Rice International is a faith-based, non-governmental organization, we call it an NGO, committed to human rights and advocacy. And we work for human rights with a special focus on children, on women, as we call gender-based violence is very prevalent, people with disabilities, especially in the school situation and in our project situations around the world, and very especially care for the earth at this time. And we do this by collaborating with and supporting our projects in the Edmund Rice Network around the world. But we don't just do that for the Edmund Rice Network. We work in conjunction with many other NGOs and faith-based organizations here in Geneva and with other congregations also. So our work has a two-pronged strategy. Well, number one, it's human rights and advocacy training to make people aware and to educate, to bring them up to speed by offering training. And then next part of our strategy then is to engage with the human rights, the United Nations human rights mechanisms and the Human Rights Council, which is centered here in Geneva. Tino will explain all that a bit more to you when he goes on. Thanks, Tino. So in terms of these 4 sessions that are going to be held during April, so first of all, we want to say that human rights and advocacy is a pillar of the global Edmund Rice mission. And Edmund Rice International invites all members of the global Edmund Rice Mission Kara networks and partner networks to a series of 4 Zoom webinars, about 90 minutes each. And this afternoon, here in Geneva, wherever it is with you, we've got people from Africa, South Africa. We had registration from Zambia, from Zimbabwe, from East Africa, South Sudan, West Africa, Ghana, Nigeria, from all over India, so welcome, from Latin America, Peru, and also from North America, New York area, California. So you are all very, very welcome to this webinar for this afternoon. And it will be concentrating on understanding the foundations of human rights and advocacy, and it will be presented by Tino, Brother Tino Abreu, one of our Edmund Rice International team members here. So with that little introduction, I want to say welcome and thank you to everybody and hand back to you, Tino. Thank you.
Thanks, Terry. Thank you very much for that introduction and for giving an overview of Edmund Rice International to all our participants. As Terry mentioned, my name is Tino, Brother Tino Abreu, and I belong to the Indian province of the Christian Brothers. And I have been a member of the ERI team here in Geneva since 2017. Today's session is on understanding the foundations of human rights and advocacy. So when you hear the words human rights, okay, what comes to your mind? What's the first thing that comes to your mind? Okay, just share that in the chat box. Put it down in the chat box. It could be a single word. It could be a couple of words. Okay, not more than a sentence. Just put it down in the chat box. I'm giving you 30 seconds to do that. And Terry, if you could just read them aloud as they come. Not all of them, but just a couple. Thank you.
Democracy. Dignity and respect, equality rights to all. Equality. Ability, dignity, respect, rights, love for humanity, freedom, equality, freedom to express, freedom to everyone, entitlements and privileges for all, safety and freedom, love to all, fundamental freedom, dignity of individual, justice, what each one of us deserves equally, entitlement, right to live freely, freedom and justice, just and dignity for all, a human life with dignity and freedom, justice, liberty, love for all, international standards on equality, freedom and rights, freedom of thoughts, equality, and to be treated with dignity.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for your comments. I really wonder if you need this training on human rights, but even then, you are most welcome. And I hope today's session will make things a little more clearer and make you a little more aware. So here now I'm coming to, all right, something like just like what I asked you. If you were to ask people in the street, what are human rights? I wonder how they would respond. Okay, so let's check that out a little bit. Let's check that out. I'm just going to once again do a new share. All right, and I hope it works as it's supposed to work. Otherwise, I will need to do something else. Okay. All right. Very good. I think it's working, so that's good. All right. So can you see, Terry, you can see my screen?
Yes,
United
yes.
for Human Rights. Okay.
That's right.
This is a wonderful website, which I would recommend to each one of you. Okay. It's called humanrights.com. Very simple. Okay. Humanrights.com. And they have you can enroll, as you see over here, a free online course. And the catch line really is, if you know your rights, they can't be taken away, right? The question is, how many of us and how many of the people that we engage with know their rights? Okay, so I would strongly recommend this website. And over here, I'm just going to go down to this little video. It's about 9 minutes plus, but I think it's very engaging and will give you a good overview of what are human rights.
Geez, that's a good question.
Human rights. Oh, that's a tough one.
Wow.
I don't even know how to give that a definition.
I would probably have to do a little bit of homework or something.
Any right that I think just as a normal,
Not good, Tino.
human, any.
The rights that humans have.
Oh, that's a very large.
I'm
debate.
sorry for that. I'm sorry for that. It's still buffering a lot. Let me just try something else.
menneskeret kan betyde mange ting.
Tú le puedes preguntar a 20 personas y te van a dar 20 diferentes opiniones.
Saprei, è una domanda complicatissima.
Guess we just take them for granted that they're there, but we don't even consider what they are.
Human rights are the rights you have simply because you're human. It's how you
expect and deserve to be treated as a person, like the right to live free, to speak your mind, and to be treated as a. There are many kinds of rights. Most apply to a certain group, but human rights are the only ones that apply to absolutely
everywhere. That means kids, old people, poor people, basketball players, garbage men, rappers, teachers, Africans, Indians, Albanians, Christians, Muslims, Kabbalists, atheists, your mom, your dad, your next door neighbor, and you all have the exact same human rights. In other words, they're universal. But the question remains, what are they?
Name the human rights?
What the human rights are?
The right to live.
Equality between all peoples.
Right to religion, the right to...
Is there supposed to be a list somewhere I should be aware of?
According to the United Nations, there are a total of 30 human rights, which are usually lumped together and called simply human rights. They're all listed out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is the world's most widely accepted document on the subject. But it was a long time in coming. At first, there were no human rights. If you were in with the right crowd, you were safe. If you weren't, well, you weren't. But then a guy named Cyrus the Great decided to change all that. After conquering Babylon, he did something completely revolutionary. He announced that all slaves were free to go. He also said people had the freedom to choose their religion, no matter what crowd they were a part of. They documented his words on a clay tablet known as the Cyrus Cylinder. And just like that, human rights were born. The idea spread quickly to Greece, to India, and eventually to Rome. They noticed that people naturally followed certain laws, even if they weren't told to. They called this natural law, but it kept getting trampled on by those in power. Not until 1,000 years later in England did they finally get a king to agree that no one can overrule the rights of the people, not even a king. People's rights were finally recognized, and they were now safe from those in power. Kind of. It still took a bunch of British rebels declaring their independence before the king got the point that all men are created equal. Which isn't to say he liked the idea, but he couldn't stop them, and America was born. The French immediately followed with their own revolution for their own rights. Their list was even longer, and they insisted that these rights weren't just made up. They were natural. The Roman concept of natural law had become natural rights. Unfortunately, not everyone was so thrilled. In France, a general named Napoleon decided to overthrow the new French democracy and crown himself emperor of the world. He almost succeeded, but the countries of Europe joined forces and defeated him. Human rights was again a hot topic. They drew up international agreements, broadly granting many rights across Europe. But only across Europe. The rest of the world somehow still didn't qualify. Instead, they got invaded, conquered, and consumed by Europe's massive empires. But then a young lawyer from India decided enough was enough. His name was Mahatma Gandhi, and in the face of violence, he insisted that all people of Earth had rights, not just in Europe. Eventually, even Europeans started to agree. But it wasn't going to be that easy. 2 world wars erupted. Hitler exterminated half the Jewish population of Earth in horrifying Nazi death camps. And all told, 90 million people died. Never had human rights been so terrifyingly close to extinction. And never had the world been more desperate for change. So the countries of Earth banded together and formed the United Nations. Their basic purpose was to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person. But what were human rights? Were they the proclamations of Cyrus, the natural laws of Rome, the declarations of France? Everyone seemed to have a slightly different idea of what human rights should be. But under the supervision of Eleanor Roosevelt, they finally agreed on a set of rights that applied to absolutely everyone. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The French concept of natural rights had finally become human rights. So, in summary, at first, only a few lucky people had any rights, until one of those guys decided, hey, other people should have some rights too, which was great, except not everyone agreed. And it only took a few thousand years of fighting and declarations and more fighting until everyone finally agreed that human rights should apply to everyone. And they all lived happily ever after. Except for one little problem. If people have the right to food and shelter, why are 16,000 children dying of starvation every day? 1 every 5 seconds. If people have freedom of speech, why are thousands in prison for speaking their minds? If people have the right to education, why are over 1 billion adults unable to read? If slavery has truly been abolished, why are 27 million people still enslaved today? More than twice as many as in 1800. The fact is, when it was signed, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights did not have the force of law. It was optional. And despite many more documents, conventions, treaties, and laws, it's still little more than words on a page. So the question is, who will make those words a reality?
I have a dream today.
When Dr. King marched for racial equality, he was marching for rights that had been guaranteed by the United Nations for almost 2 decades. But still, he marched. When Nelson Mandela stood up for social justice in the 1990s, his country had already agreed to abolish such discrimination for almost 40 years. But still, he fought. Those who fight today against torture, poverty, and discrimination are not giants or superheroes. They're people. Kids, mothers, fathers, teachers. Free-thinking individuals who refuse to be silent. Who realize that human rights are not a history lesson. They're not words on a page. They're not speeches or commercials or PR campaigns. They are the choices we make every day as human beings. They are the responsibility we all share to respect each other, to help each other, and to protect those in need. As Eleanor Roosevelt said, where, after all, do universal human rights begin? In small places close to home. So close and so small that they cannot be seen on any maps of the world. Yet they are the world of the individual person, the neighborhood he lives in, the school or college he attends, the factory, farm, or office where he works. Such are the places where every man, woman, and child seeks equal justice, equal opportunity, equal dignity without discrimination. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere.
So, thank you very much. Apologies for some of the sound issues that we had. I'm just going to go back to the PowerPoint now. Right. So here's another good video. Okay, I'm not going to play this one. All right, and it's on the it's again on human rights and this and their and how they came into being and how they are being treated, or how people are being treated today, and what we can do. All right, this presentation will be shared with you, so you can always watch it at your own convenience. So human rights, all right. As we saw in the video over there, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights came into being and was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in 1948. And in 1973, it became part of international law, and which means that all states, okay, all countries of the world have embedded these rights into their constitutions, their policies, their strategies on how to and given these rights to their citizens and the people living in their countries. But the question remains, in our lifetime, as we look around, do you think that human rights are again under threat? Once again, in the chat box, I'm going to invite you to just say yes, no, or not sure. Okay, so yes, no, or not sure. So kindly go ahead. I can't see the responses. So Terry, could you just give me a little brief?
Everybody is saying yes, 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 yes.
Okay, all right. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. So here are the 30 rights, okay, in the UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I'm just giving you another 30 seconds to just read through them quickly, okay, and just focus on the ones that stick out for you today. Which are the ones which are being most violated, you feel? And not just in some country outside where you are from, but maybe even in your country, maybe even in your neighborhood. Okay, which one do you feel is being most violated or needs to be addressed? I just want to draw your attention to number 1, okay, which says over there, we are all born free with equal rights. All right, we are all born free with equal rights, born. So it's not something that has been given to us. We are born with them. All right, whether it's a man, woman, child, all human beings, irrespective of where you come from. And then I want to draw your attention to number 30. No one can take away our human rights. No one. Not the person beside me, not a government official, no one. Yes, they can try to deny me my rights, or they can violate my rights, but they can't take them away. And that's why awareness of my rights is so important. Finally, I'd just like to draw your attention to number 26. We have a right to education, right? And we just look around our world, we just look around maybe even in our neighborhoods. Do all children enjoy that right today? And SDG 4 talks about a quality education, not just a right to education, but the right to a quality education. I think all of us on this Zoom session have been blessed with that quality education. Before I leave this, I want to go to number 25 also. We have a right to health, food, clothing, and housing. A right. Okay. We're looking at the horrors that are taking place in Gaza these days. We're also aware of the different aid agencies that are working so hard to try and bring food to the people of Gaza, to avert a famine. And we're also aware of the attack that took place on the World Central Kitchen aid staff, killing 7 of them. Where are we? Rights, human rights are universal and inalienable. What does that mean? That means they apply to all people, everywhere, at all times. And as I said, they can be denied or violated. And we can think of the war zones in our world today, whether they're in Ukraine, whether they are in South Sudan or Sudan, whether we are looking at Gaza, Syria, okay? But these rights still exist. They can't be taken away. They're indivisible. That means each one of them, they're all equally important and all must be respected. A criticism sometimes made of the US, for example, is that political rights, such as the right to free speech, peaceful assembly, etc., are stressed. The rights of an individual are stressed. But other rights, like socio-political rights, such as the right to an adequate standard of living, are not assigned the same priority, resulting in unacceptable levels of poverty in the US. By comparison, China has made great strides in lifting people out of poverty. But there are serious concerns about the respect for civil and political rights, the right to free speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, etc. The point I'm trying to make is that all rights are important. But we also remember no country has a perfect record on human rights. A third characteristic of human rights is that they're interdependent and interrelated. In other words, the fulfillment of one right often depends wholly or in part upon the fulfillment of others. For example, the fulfillment of the right to an adequate standard of living may depend on having access to education or to social security, or the enjoyment of the right to education may depend on having the right to food. A child that comes to school hungry may not be in a position to learn properly, for example. I would also like to add here that it can be sometimes difficult to balance different rights. For example, freedom of speech. Does that mean hate speech is acceptable or incitement to violence that may threaten life and well-being of others? We've just heard in the news about the child who resorted to violence in Finland because he was being bullied in school. A related question might be about children's rights. Should children be free to exercise all these rights when perhaps they lack maturity and experience and could be at risk of harming themselves? Children's rights are spelled out in more detail in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, a treaty that has been ratified by all countries in the world except one. And in this treaty, they speak about a child's right to receive appropriate direction and guidance from their parents and guardians. So that is also a right of the child. So we come to the question, therefore, who is responsible for ensuring human rights? And here I'd like to share with you this diagram and these two categories of people, the duty bearers and the rights holders. Who are duty bearers? They are people or entities who are obliged to deliver and ensure human rights, while the rights holders are all people, which include the people who are also duty bearers. So duty bearers must fulfill their obligations to the rights holders, and right holders should have the freedom and the opportunity to claim their rights from duty bearers. The principal duty bearer is the state. While non-state duty bearers include, among the primary non-state duty bearers would be parents for their children, teachers for their students, doctors for their patients. Secondary non-state duty bearers would be institutions like schools and the management of schools. Tertiary would be NGOs and aid institutions, while external would be the UN, UNESCO. The principal, I just want to spend a little time on the principal duty bearer, the state. Why do we call them the principal duty bearer? Because the state has ratified different UN human rights treaties. As I said, all states have accepted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They have put these into their constitution. They have legalized these rights. And therefore, it is their responsibility and their obligation to abstain from carrying out, sponsoring, or tolerating any practice, okay, that does not that violates the integrity of individuals or impinges on their freedom to access resources to satisfy their needs. So the state is the principal duty bearer when it comes to delivering and ensuring human rights. So when human rights are under threat, as you all said they are today, or being violated, how can one respond? This is one way we can respond, okay? The charity or the aid model, right? Again, what comes to mind when you hear the word charity or aid? I won't ask you to put it down in the chat box, but just be aware of it in your mind. And then I'm going to give you a second action word, advocacy. Once again, what comes to mind when you hear this word? What image? What thought? And finally, which of these two action words can you connect with better? Before I came to Geneva, charity was the word I could connect with better. And when I say that, I mean I understood it better. I participated in it. I understood better what a charity or service response to a need like hunger was. When I was based in our school in Dum Dum, Kolkata, the brothers used to organize every evening a packed meal for the homeless who lived on the street outside our walls. More than 75 people gathered every evening to collect their packed meal and satisfy their hunger. This was our charity or service response to their need. I'm going to give you 30 seconds to think of a charity response from your experience. It could be something you did as an individual or as a group, or you are aware of someone else doing. So you have 30 seconds. So thank you. As we go through our session today, keep coming back to that experience. Keep that sometimes at the back of your mind, sometimes bring it in front. Now let's try and understand advocacy. To do this, let's ask, what is the difference between an advocacy response to a need or an issue and a charity response? To help us to do this, we're going to listen to Brother Brian Bourne, the Executive Director of Edmund Rice International, who's currently on holiday in Australia. So he's going to share with us his experience of responding to a need.
So I want to clarify what we mean by an advocacy or a justice response, as opposed to a charity or a service response. And I'll do that by recounting my experience of working with students from our schools in Melbourne some years ago, before I came to Geneva, in what we call a street retreat. So I would take a group of students to a local parish, where we would link up with volunteers from the St Vincent de Paul Society who conducted a soup van, where they distributed unsold food collected from local shops, prepared soup, and then drove a van to a pre-arranged location where the food was distributed to homeless people, people living on the streets, or in cheap boarding houses. At the end of that experience, we would have a debrief where the students shared and reflected on their experience. Students felt positive about their experience, as we all do when we do something good for others. I would point out that whilst it was good and important that food and conversation had been provided to those who needed it, nothing had changed. And when the students returned home to their warm bed, their mother's cooking, those people would still be there tomorrow, the next week, the next month, probably the next year. And all of that leads to the why question. Why, in an affluent society like Australia, are people forced to live on the streets? What does it say about the way society cares for people who are suffering from mental illness? Conversation soon revealed that a number of those people we met were suffering from some form of a mental illness. So asking why is the first step in advocacy, which aims to address the underlying causes of injustice And how do we address those causes? By speaking to those who have the power to make change, or better still, by empowering those affected to speak up for themselves. Usually advocacy is directed at governments, perhaps multinational businesses. For example, I recently joined the campaign and emailed directors of a Korean bank urging them to reject the financing of a proposed new coal mining project in Australia. Advocacy can take the form of letter writing, signing petitions, in-person lobbying, marches, demonstrations. Think of the climate action movement initiated by Greta Thunberg, the young Swedish girl. And advocacy can take place at the local level, the national level, or the international level, which is the focus of ERI's work here in Geneva.
So that was Brother Brian Bond sharing his experience and his thoughts on charity and the aid model versus the advocacy or the justice model. I want to make it very clear over here, I'm not making a case of either or, but rather stressing that both charity and advocacy are important. Right? When we think of the people of Gaza today, almost in a state of famine, even though food is available just across the border, and we think of all the aid agencies, the international aid agencies, like the World Central Kitchen, who are working hard to make sure that they don't starve, that they get at least some food, at least a meal a day, right? We see how important this aid is in this situation today. And one can only pray that the situation will improve and at least aid agencies will once again begin distribution of food safely in the Gaza Strip. So charity or aid provides direct services like food, clothing, and shelter, while an advocacy response promotes social change in institutions or political structures. And that's what we're hoping that's happening in this whole conflict going on in Israel, between Israel and Gaza over there. That states are putting pressure so that the parties can come to the table and can come up with a ceasefire. The same between Ukraine and Russia, the same in so many other hotspots of our world. Charity or aid is directed at the effects of injustice, while advocacy is directed at the root causes of social problems and addresses the underlying structures or causes of these problems. Charity or aid responds to immediate needs and looks for immediate solutions, while advocacy responds to long-term needs and looks for long-term solutions. In most cases, charity is often about private, individual acts. But in cases like in Gaza, it's international aid agencies that are also involved. Advocacy is more effective with public, collective actions, as we see in the collective actions taking place in India right now by the farmers who are protesting and trying to advocate for a decent price for their grain. Charity and an aid response calms things down, while a justice and an advocacy response stirs things up. We know from current and recent examples in places like Myanmar, Afghanistan, where demands for human rights challenge those in power, those who have an interest in preserving that privileged position can respond with repression and violence. We are watching live the consequences of the war in Ukraine, of the Israeli response to the Hamas, horrific Hamas attack on their citizens, their response now in Gaza. But sadly, closer to home, I'm sure you'll be able to recall current examples of threats and violence perpetrated on those who speak up for human rights or condemn injustice. Jesus himself challenged the system in Israel of his time. He overturned the tables of the money changers in the temples that he saw as exploiting people. He condemned the Pharisees and religious leaders as hypocrites, false guides, a stand that was ultimately to cost him his life. He took the side of the woman caught in adultery and saved her life. I'd like to end this particular section with this quote from Helder Camara, former Archbishop in Brazil. When I feed the poor, they call me a saint. But when I ask why the poor are hungry, they call me a communist. So advocacy in all its forms seeks to ensure that people, particularly those who are most vulnerable in society, are able to have their voice heard on issues that are important to them, defend and safeguard their rights, have their views and wishes genuinely considered when decisions are being made about their lives. Advocacy works to create public policy that respects, protects, and fulfills human rights obligations in our home, community, and around the world. Advocacy targets the duty bearers. And so, Edmund Rice International, how do we target the duty bearers? The principal duty bearers, which are the states. We do that by engaging with the UN human rights mechanisms and the Human Rights Council here in Geneva. How are we able to do that? We are able to do that because we have special consultative status as an NGO, what is called ECOSOC status at the UN. And because we have ECOSOC status at the UN, the Global Edmund Rice Network has a voice in both Geneva and New York. And we are able to bring the stories of denial and violation of earth, child, and human rights to the Human Rights Council using the UN human rights mechanisms. Before I go to the mechanisms, I'd just like to spend a little time on the United Nations and the 6 principal organs of the UN. These are the General Assembly, the Security Council, and the Economic and Social Council that has given ERI special consultative status. All these 3 are based in New York. The International Court of Justice is based in The Hague. And then, of course, helping each of these to perform their roles and responsibilities is a large secretariat, the UN Secretariat. They oversee a range of other subsidiary bodies, committees, boards, working parties. And one of the most important of these subsidiary bodies is the Human Rights Council, which is based here in Geneva and where ERI regularly interacts with them. What are the objectives of the United Nations organization? Cooperation in international law, international security, economic development, social progress, human rights, and world peace. All of these, except for human rights, come up for discussion, come up for action at the UN Security Council and the General Assembly in New York. But human rights comes up for discussion and action here in Geneva at the UN Human Rights Council. And that is one of the reasons why our team of 3 are based here in Geneva, so that we can participate and engage with the UN Human Rights Council. Here we can tell the stories of our time in the halls of power. And our mission is to take the stories of those who cry out and make claim to their rights to the Human Rights Council of the United Nations that has the power to challenge unjust regimes and governments. And the tool that we use are known as the UN Human Rights Mechanisms, and they are the Universal Periodic Review, the treaty bodies, and the special procedures. I will not be going into more detail about these UN human rights mechanisms, because in our next session, next Thursday, we'll be taking up these UN human rights mechanisms in more detail and sharing a lot of examples of how we and our partners here in Geneva engage with them. I will, however, speak a little bit about the written and oral statements that we make at the Human Rights Council sessions. This is the room in which the Human Rights Council meets here at the Palais Nations or Nation. And at the moment, the Human Rights Council session is in progress. It has been so for the last 5 weeks. In fact, this has been one of the longest sittings of the Human Rights Council. The Human Rights Council is a forum empowered to prevent abuses, inequity, and discrimination, and protect the most vulnerable and expose perpetrators. And this is why ERI also engages with them, to help them in this role of theirs. Only NGOs with consultative status with the United Nations, ECOSOC, and ECOSOC Council can participate in the human rights sessions as observers. And that is the reason ERI can address the Council during interactive discussions and debates, thus highlighting human rights violations around the globe. As NGOs, ERI is able, among other things, to submit written statements to the Human Rights Council, make oral interventions to the Human Rights Council, and during a Human Rights Council session, we have the opportunity to participate in debates, interactive dialogues, panel discussions, and informal meetings. I'd like to end this first session of us training today by showing you a couple of our interventions at the Human Rights Council. I'll just share once again, start a new share. So the first one I'd like to share with you, the first clip I'd like to share with you is a clip that is a video statement that ERI delivered on behalf of the Justice Desk Africa, and it was on violence against children.
I now give the floor to the representative of Edmund Rice International Limited.
Mr. President, all children in South Africa have the right to be protected from abuse, violence, and neglect. The Children's Act further reiterates the importance of protecting children from abuse, harm, and neglect, as well as the various services and resources available to help protect the needs of the child. Despite this, South Africa continues to be a violent environment for children to live. It is estimated that the child homicide rate is 5.5 per 100,000, twice the global average. It is further estimated that nearly half of all child homicides in South Africa were due to abuse or neglect. This violence negatively affects children in various ways. Psychological consequences of violence against children include depression, anxiety disorders, substance abuse, suicide, as well as unwanted pregnancies and HIV. Experiences of childhood violence also have the ability to stunt cognitive development, leading to long-term consequences within the life of the child. Edmund Rice International and Justice Desk Africa therefore recommend that the government should prioritize the protection of all children through a creation of a separate portfolio committee to address the issue of violence against children. Create parent and guardian-specific programs that will prioritize and promote positive parenting interactions and the skills needed to parent effectively. Work within communities to create and implement child protection and safeguarding strategies to address and reduce instances of child abuse. Conduct increased trainings with teachers and caregivers to properly identify and report instances of abuse. Thank you.
Thank you.
So that was the ERI delivering a Justice Desk Africa statement on behalf of them. And because one of the fruits, you could say, good things that came out of COVID was that video statements were allowed to be delivered. And it gave an opportunity for Edmund Rice International to invite people from the ground who are actually working on these issues, okay, to deliver these statements themselves, rather than team members here in Geneva delivering them in person. Yes, we are, and we do deliver statements also in person. This is another statement I'd like to share with you. This was at the present Human Rights Council, the 55th session of the Human Rights Council, and it was delivered during the UPR Outcomes of Canada. We'll talk more about the UPR at our next session, but I'd like to just share this particular statement also with you. It was delivered just a couple of days back by Michelle Rapier, our contact in Canada, who teaches in one of the brothers' schools in Vancouver.
Edmund Rice International, par video.
Commends the participation of Canada in its 4th UPR. We commend Canada's commitment to advancing reconciliation and renewing its relationships with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, especially concerning food security and access to clean drinking water. Furthermore, we remain deeply concerned about protection of the rights of some of Canada's most vulnerable people, in particular the elderly, people with disabilities, and people experiencing mental illness. While welcoming the acceptance of recommendation number 37.279, we remain concerned by the eligibility criteria for receiving medical assistance in dying, MAID, and the promotion of MAID as a more cost-effective alternative to other healthcare options, to the detriment of the ultimate protection of Canada's most vulnerable. This NGO coalition calls on Canada to adopt prompt and effective measures to ensure food security and access to clean drinking water for all Indigenous communities, to improve ease of access, funding, and staffing for long-term care facilities in order to provide adequate assistance to the elderly, including quality palliative care. To ensure adequate and meaningful participation of people with disabilities, as well as their representative organizations, in drafting laws, policies, and regulations that affect their rights, particularly with regard to MAID. To update the eligibility criteria for MAID to ensure protection of the most vulnerable, including the removal of mental illness as one of the co-qualifying considerations for access to MAID. Thank you.
I thank you.
So that was at the UPR Outcomes of Canada, as I said, a couple of days back. And the final statement I'd like to play over here.
Hi, Contd, it's Michigan Trini who live on August Tommy and shot the scene at the.
Sorry about that. Is a statement delivered by, again, Brother Brian Bourne. This time, this statement was delivered in response to the report of the Special Rapporteur on Myanmar. Now, many of our faith-based partners have people in Myanmar. Okay, we don't. And so therefore, on behalf of them, we deliver the statement because so that there is no, so that their people on the ground are not targeted by the statement that we deliver.
Now I'd like to invite Edmund Rice International Limited, intervention by video.
Mr. President, we welcome the report of the Special Rapporteur on Myanmar and commend his recommendations, in particular the call for the military junta to end attacks against civilians and gross human rights violations. The humanitarian situation faced by internally displaced persons continues to be deeply concerning. We condemn the deliberate targeting of IDP camps and civilian buildings by the State Administration Council, including nearby religious and educational institutions. As fighting moves from rural areas to cities and towns, internal displacement and humanitarian needs continue to grow. We deplore the numerous attacks against medical infrastructure since the coup that have contributed to a dire healthcare situation and led to dangerously low rates of immunisations for children and worrying consequences for maternal health. It is concerning that as humanitarian needs mount, aid funding is unable to keep pace. We request members of the Council to 1. Prioritise funding for civil society organisations able to distribute humanitarian aid to remote locations affected by the ongoing conflict. 2. Condemn in the strongest terms airstrikes and shelling against IDP camps, as well as civilian households, hospitals, clinics, schools, monasteries and church institutions, including through the use of unguided aerial bombs. 3. End impunity in Myanmar by ensuring the establishment of an international mechanism to hold perpetrators of atrocity crimes accountable. Thank you.
Thank
I'll just stop sharing this at the moment. So these are some examples of the way in which ERI advocates on behalf of the partners at the grassroots level at the UN, how we are able to be a channel through which voices from the grassroots can be heard at the UN. I'll be sharing this PowerPoint with you, and so you will be able to, at your own convenience, watch these videos if you'd like to again. I would also like to draw your attention to our website and our newsletter. And I would encourage you to explore our website and subscribe to our newsletter. So Terry, I'll give you the floor and first to respond to some of the comments and questions that have come up. Over to you, Terry.
Yeah, most of the issues put in the chat were very positive about how they understanding advocacy and more about what goes on at the UN. Sharing the link for the newsletter was asked. Somebody requiring a little more information about the UN mechanisms, which will happen next week. what the 6 organs of the United Nations are, what its objectives are. Why can't the United Nations take action? Well, that's, many people say the United Nations is useless when you look at it around the world today, all the issues that it does take up. It's what Tino said, the main duty bearer is the state. And unless the state carries out its human rights obligations, the United Nations cannot legally enforce the state to carry it out. It can name and it can shame, it can bring up issues, but unless the state responds, the United Nations cannot do anything really as such. In some cases, for example, when the Security Council meets, when they discuss something, well, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council each have a veto right, and so it goes nowhere. So there is, especially for the Security Council, calls for the reformation of the Security Council to be more representative and to be reformed. Whereas in the mechanisms here at the Human Rights Council, it's mainly the UPR, the Universal Periodic Review. Each state is reviewed every 4.5 years. We'll explain that next week. But it's naming and shaming what's going on, and people and the states don't like to do that. But there is the political agenda also. You've got the divide in the Human Rights Council between various states. For example, Pakistan will have a go at India, and India will have a go at Pakistan. Azerbaijan and Armenia will go at each other, and so it goes on. Where the law comes in is, we'll speak about treaty bodies next week, where if a state is signed up for the treaty, it becomes a state party, and it's got to bring its domestic law in line with the treaty system. And that has got a far stronger influence on a state. But we'll speak about that later. So I hope I've answered that a little bit, Tino.
Yeah, thanks very much, Terry. Yeah, I'd just like to add to what Terry has shared. Okay, please remember that the UN is not made of NGOs. The UN, the members of the UN are the states themselves. And so, as Terry pointed out, okay, when states are coming together to discuss issues concerning violence, conflict, peacekeeping, things like that, political agendas also come to the forefront. So yes, the UN is very political. And here in Geneva at the Human Rights Council, we see that at every session of the Human Rights Council, how groups of states will band together and make statements against states that are not part of them. But the good thing about the system, the good thing about the Human Rights Council is that they hold one another accountable. A state cannot get away with violation of human rights. Okay, and that's why NGOs play a very important role, right? They are able to make statements at the Human Rights Council and also hold states accountable. It's very interesting, as Terry pointed out, states don't like to be held accountable, right? And in many cases, okay, they take it out on human rights defenders, right? In some states, like in India, for example, the state has gone against human rights NGOs by taking away their, what do you call it?
Their right to operate, you know?
Yeah, the right to operate. No, taking away their right to get funds from abroad. okay, and so basically paralyzing them. Right. So it's very interesting that at the Human Rights Council, at the start of a Human Rights Council session, okay, the president will announce that that any threat to human rights defenders, okay, will be taken very seriously by the council. So, so the council, as again Terry pointed out, does not have powers legal powers to force a state to do anything, but they do have the power to hold a state accountable. Okay. Anything else you'd like to add? Any other comments that might have come up?
Nothing so far.
Okay. All right. Very good. Okay. So thank you. It's not normally that we finish on time, but it's great to see that we are finishing 10 minutes ahead of time. Okay. And we thank you for being present. Thank you for making the time. Thank you for all your positive comments. And next week, we'll be having a deeper or a closer look at how at the UN human rights mechanisms and how NGOs with ECOSOC status like ERI can and do engage, and why it is so important for NGOs to network and collaborate with one another so that they can speak with one voice and have a stronger influence at the UN. So these are some of the things with examples that we'll be looking at next week.
I just think it's important to point out that when we are making statements, etc., we get our information from the people on the ground. We revise the statement, knock it into shape, because we only allowed a certain number of words and a certain amount of time to do the presentation. But this is how we get our information, from the people on the ground around the world. And that is the basis of all our statements that we do at the UN here.
Thank you, Terry. Thank you for that. And that's the reason why we also have our trainings. I see a number of participants present on today's Zoom over here who have attended our Geneva training here, our 2-week training here in Geneva, and also some who will be attending in June this year. So we look forward to welcoming you. Training both in creating awareness as well as in skills is important so that, as Terry says, we can get credible information from the ground. Okay, you can imagine if we are making a statement at the UN, it is being scrutinized, especially by the state that we are addressing. And if our information is not credible, is not factual, okay, it's a black mark on our organization. So we have to be very careful when making statements that our sources are credible, and so for that, we use a lot of government data itself. Okay, as well as personal experiences of people, as you saw in the statement that was made on Myanmar. So thank you once again. And Terry, any last words?
Just to say thank you to everyone from around the world for giving up their time. It was very good of you, and thank you for your positive feedback. Thank you.